Adesso io comincio
I'll just sketch a few things.
un po' di cose. No? Comunque,
Yeah, let's see.
io faccio
I'll do something like this.
Adesso
I don't know whether it looks good or bad. I'm just improvising.
Ok.
Once more.
Adesso di qua in avanti
I'm sure there are two different forms of life.
una è quella
The canonical one? We're born with numbers, and our life runs along these numbers. We even forget our individual names.
ci dimentichiamo per esempio il nome. Poi ce n'è un'altra,
Then there's another, with its own impetus,
è l'inconscio,
the unconscious.
che,
It takes decisions and remembers things.
che
It surfaces at the right
e al
moment.
momento buono esce. Difatti la mia filosofia
In fact,
è
my philosophy is, when you lose something meaningful, don't go looking for it. Sooner or later, it will come looking for you.
prima o poi. È sempre successo così,
It always happens that way. Always.
sempre.
Una bella donna, come
Both
una
a beautiful woman and a beautiful car make you want to seduce, feel free, reach a goal. Either to seduce a beautiful woman, or in the case of a car, to reach a certain distant goal, maybe in order to seduce a beautiful woman.
Una bella donna.
Tutta la mia vita è stata, per
I count
fortuna,
myself lucky because I lead my entire life pursuing my passion, starting at the age of 4 when I was given an erector set.
scatola del meccano, e che è passata il primo tempo.
I went through a theoretical phase at first, a phase of many drawings and few, if any, creations.
Le realizzazioni. Le cose sono cambiate un po' occupandomi di
When I started working on car bodies, things changed a little,
di fare
especially when I had the chance to participate in the planning of automobiles,
vere, importanti,
real and important ones like this one.
come questa.
You know, designing a car is not just the idea. It's not a brilliant idea, two tail fins or whatever. It's how you interpret this idea. And to interpret this idea, you have to have a good sense of proportion. That's essential. I am a pure designer, so I like the aesthetics. I'm not a good engineer. But everyone has their own specialty, let's say.
Design is considered to be the utmost talent in our country. We are seen as an intensely creative people, with our creativity expressing itself through furnishings, fashion, and also through automobile design. For a young man who wanted to become part of the automobile world, the 1960s were a paradise of creativity. The era was extremely fertile because year after year, auto show after auto show, we always looked for new expressions, more radical and extreme shapes.
In 1958, Italy, Torino in particular, was the center of design the world over. You had automobile design in Italy. Directors from all the big companies came to Torino for the automobile show to see the latest, styling exercises.
I am a child of the 1960s, raised on bread and automobiles. The cars back then were more and more concept cars and less automobiles. Cars like the Carabo and Modulo seemed more like spaceships than functioning automobiles. In those days, it was a dream come true.
The post-war period began with the Vespa and continued with the Fiat 600, the Fiat 500, and so on.
Innovations became an important factor in the automobile industry in general and with regards to the car bodies in particular. You could create things that turned out to be very successful. I had a storehouse of desires, and little by little, I filled the pigeonholes. And the Miura was the opportunity to pull out some of them. In those days, no one would think of making headlights for a showroom prototype or limited production. So they used whatever was around. For example, the headlights for the 850 Spider, they did the same with the taillight. But it was a shame to see a car like that realized with headlights taken from a Fiat. So my idea was to try to mask them with these flaps. Originally, they were used for the interior ventilation, but they really served no purpose at all.
The day I was hired was the happiest day of my life. It was like stepping into a magical world, being part of this special community. Back then, we were called stylists. We built cars in an era of optimism, never worrying about automobile safety. We believed that someday in the future, cars would be able to spread their wings and just take off.
With ingenuity, first of all. Imagination and ingenuity. We even made cars without any drafts. It was all in our imagination. I'm no designer. Mr. Gandini is a stylist. I'm a metal worker, but still I made cars. When I was making Ferraris, they had to be gutsy, but also beautiful. I liked making them.
It was a fabulous period because automobiles were starting to be considered pieces of art. Like an object that needs shaping and not something technical, solely mechanical. So they began thinking about sprucing up the automobiles. You could indulge in your own ingenuity. That's why during that period, cars came out which are considered milestones in automotive history even today.
Lo stile è un modo di sentire.
Style is a way of feeling. If you have ingenuity and the talent to shape your own ideas, that's imagination, I think.
Quella secondo me si chiama immaginazione.
If you're lucky enough to have both ingenuity and imagination, I think that's called creativity. Passion came from driving. I started driving at 12. Shortly afterwards, I began spending time at the Monza racetrack in the car of friends who already owned a license. Back in those days, I was more interested in driving than designing. I even began racing cars before I had a license. I'd go to Monza with friends. We'd rent the track, which didn't cost much back then. One or two of us had a license, but the others drove without one. It was a closed circuit, so it wasn't dangerous. At the beginning of the last century, when the automobile saw the light of day, Turin was a very beautiful, elegant city. The filmmaking industry and the great fashion houses were in Turin, all in the wake of the once-present royal house. Carriage production was important, and it was done here because the clientele was here.
History says its origins come from the valleys around Turin, where there are boilermakers who worked with copper. That's where the expertise of shaping sheet metal came from.
Automobiles were made with a frame, just like carriages. An engine substituted the horses, and on top of it, they built the car body. A craft is born. It spreads. Some go to work for a company to learn the craft, and afterwards found their own companies. The same goes for the automotive industry, for the people that built the engines, the frames, the car bodies.
In the beginning, there was a high level of manufacturing specialization. It allowed for the making of functioning prototypes from the 1920s to the post-war 1950s, and a wealthy clientele that could afford these unique models.
You know, there were many people involved in the carriage design, before the war. And I think it was just their natural ability. They could design, you had what they call panel beaters, they could make cars by hand. And no other place in the world could you do this.
There's a culture, a craftsmanship which was once handed down from father to son, and now from one colleague to another. Forging the metal for wheels was the craft of the Bertoni founder, Nuccio Bertoni's father. That was his specialty. Naturally, the most capable craftsmen were the most sought after, and And if they had a natural sense of business, they'd create their own workshop.
The successful auto body workers from an industrial point of view were those who managed the transition from being craftsmen, working on a single piece, to becoming businessmen. In the 1950s, they produced thousands of units. I'm thinking especially of Pininfarina and Bertone.
It's a bit like the Silicon Valley. A famous designer, Fioravanti, once called it the Car Valley because building an automobile became an industry here.
In the post-war period, Italian auto body workers, partly because of their great creative abilities and partly because they had worked very hard to recreate the pre-war conditions, were the first to understand that standards had totally changed. The emerging mass automotive industry in Europe greatly relied upon Italian designers to design the cars for mass production. Let's take Pininfarina, who worked for Peugeot and Austin Morris, or Michelotti, who worked for Triumph. Michelotti made the first BMW 1500, the blueprint for all others. Bertone worked for NSU Prince and also for BMW. All Italian auto body workers worked with foreign manufacturers and built a network of knowledge and competence. That allowed them to expand their activity as auto body workers to becoming design consultants. This enabled them to establish design offices in order to create trends and to influence the European automotive industry.
After the war, some cars were designed in Italy that are sold for phenomenal prices today by people who cannot design. They never designed with a pencil or paper. They did it by hand, by instinct.
These people had gained their experiences before the era of the stylists. Pininfarina, Bertone, and others were able to create models completely without the help of any kind of draft or sketch.
It's a matter of innate creativity. In those days, we saw how people without any formal education became great masters. One example is Giancarlo Guerra, who out of nothing gave form to fantastic automobiles for Ferrari. He would simply envisage them. We've known people like Gandini. If Giugiaro was the Michelangelo of Italian design, he'd be the Leonardo da Vinci, because he was more interested in the technique, the engineering side of it.
I only finished elementary school. I had a special feel for things, and I instructed the engineers. They were under my wings.
I spent many years in secondary school, but later on I designed on my own. I loved racing cars, so I drew them all the time. I was interested in the shape, but especially the basic concepts and the mechanics, even if I didn't know much at the time.
They'd give me a monoblock, a shell, 4 old wheels. I'd position the static load, and then I'd place a cord. I didn't need anything else. I'd only use a calibrated cord, that was it. And from that, I'd create the whole shape. I drew sketches at home. I used wooden blocks to indicate the encumbrance of the carburetors. That's how we made cars.
A me piaceva costruire.
I've always liked to build things. As a child, I'd build small objects and toys, trying to imitate or reinvent what was around me. I was lucky to meet a great master in the 1960s. It was Giovanni Michelotti, who taught me how to draw.
Negli anni 60, che era Giovanni Michelotti, il quale mi ha insegnato a disegnare. Io sapevo disegnare, ma non
I knew how to
sapevo
sketch, but I didn't know what to sketch. Michelotti taught me to transfer my dreams into automobiles.
a tradurre I miei sogni in automobili.
I don't follow archetypes. I don't read magazines. I don't go to showrooms. I like to invent. I think this was my, not luck, but my way of living.
Fortuna, ma è il mio modo di vivere.
The Fiat 130 came into being with the Rolls Camargue, the only car in the entire history of that brand which was designed by an Italian. The English wanted something Italian, and these straight lines, so different from the traditional Rolls, influenced the Fiat 130. The configuration was very similar. In fact, some called it the younger sister. The similarity is obvious. I'm the first to say so.
C'è un qualche cosa di fatti sono io a dirlo.
My adventure began at preschool age because I always drew automobiles and liked copying them from magazines too, whenever I had one at hand. In my parents' house, there was this magazine lying around, the Reale Automobile Club of Italy, a rather large magazine in black and white, telling you everything about the world of automobiles. These things fascinated me. The ads which promoted the cars, as well as the reports on the races, the Grand Prix of those days, the battles between Alfa Romeo and the Germans, the Mercedes and the Auto Union. I even took an interest in the ads for automobile components.
Le pubblicità degli oggetti e dei componenti che riguardavano il mondo dell'automobile.
At 12, I would steal my father's car keys, these longish, straight things used for the Fiat 1100 and the Fiat 500, the Topolino. I'd drive around while he was asleep. When he finally started teaching me how to drive, he said, "You're a very good driver."
In 1955-56, I was designing cars where you had to lie so flat on your back that you looked at the road from between your feet. I'd lie on the bed to see how you could drive, looking out from between your feet. I liked driving. In fact, even as a young man, I owned sports cars. Obviously, not the ones I had designed, but still, I always liked them.
We'd have contests of car spotting, of recognizing cars, not by their shapes, but by a picture of their tail lights. We'd identify them by their screws.
I'd hang out in the garages to get to know the materials the components were made of.
Back then, uphill races were very popular. Both racing cars and tuned ordinary cars participated. The suspension system and the engine had been manipulated a little bit. But they were actually slower than the standard ones.
We kids would borrow our parents' cars, making up some kind of excuse.
This is a luxury car, American style. I set my drawings in front of a mansion. This is the main gate. Here's a super sports car, in the lineup to the Mille Miglia, an uphill race. A convertible on a scenic route, close to the water. A racing car, positioned at a pit stop. Even a small truck. I like to invent promotional vehicles like these. For example, this was for Coca-Cola, or this one. I like to invent things like that.
The Dino is a very important car. It was Sergio Pininfarina's idea. I designed my version of it, and they chose it. This is it. This car had a rear engine. That's why the front is lower than usual. Its bumpers protruded. It's an outstanding car. When Ferrari accepted the design and started the production, it turned out to be the car with the highest sales volume ever.
The vehicles of other car designers of the time were more catchy. The ones Pininfarina designed were considered, well, to be interesting. A few years later, the others had disappeared, and Pininfarina's became more and more beautiful as time passed.
All the Pininfarina vehicles are austere, except for a few. A unique example is the Modulo.
The Pininfarina management didn't want to produce the Modulo. In fact, they hid it under a tarp for 6 months. One day Pininfarina asked me, how on earth could you make a... He didn't even want to call it a car, a thing like that. And I said, sir, it wasn't supposed to be an automobile. It's as simple as that.
Questa capacità di essere creativi.
The basis of the Italian design was this ability to be creative, to have that special feel for the shapes, even without being a trained designer or stylist.
Era la base della creatività del design italiano.
Pininfarina himself didn't design, but he had good taste. He knew how to select. He'd correct and optimize the ideas that our imagination had created.
Pininfarina had a very good eye for design. He didn't design the cars himself, but he had a good eye to see what was good, what was bad. And so that's very important, you say.
Lui sapeva.
He knew how to read a design and recognized tiny variations. He'd ask one of his panel beaters to modify a line, making it tighter or softer. The next day, when this had been done, he could immediately tell the difference. And if it hadn't been done exactly as he wanted it, he'd say, "You didn't do what I asked you to do," and make him modify it.
Well, the way we did it at Pininfarina, of course, we had to make a full-size drawing of the car, and what they call full-size lofting drawing, which is used to make the model, full-size model. So it takes from 2 to 3 weeks to make the drawing with all the sections. Then you have to make the model, which takes maybe a month and a half to do that. Then from there, you make any modifications you have to make. Then you make the prototype using the model, not to hammer the metal over it, but as a guide.
I make them because I love the 3 dimensions they have. Objects have 3 dimensions. If not, they'd simply be drawings. So I think 3-dimensionally. In fact, I call my models 3-dimensional sketches.
To design something without any clear goal is something I've never accepted. I preferred imagining the final phase, what it should turn out to be, and why, and for whom.
Elio Zagato was an excellent driver and was still racing. Naturally, he wanted his cars to win, so they were made to measure. I'd follow the trials to find out what he needed to be able to drive faster. That's how I learned. A hands-on experience taught me to design them for their natural purpose, which was to win races.
The change from what was called being a stylist to being a designer occurred when additional technical elements were introduced. They started introducing functional elements, ergonomics, visibility.
The systems were very practical. I looked at the sketches of those who had achieved the best aerodynamic results. I looked at what the Germans had done before the war. In the 1930s, there were theories by professors from the University of Stuttgart, Professor König Faxenfeld and Professor Wunibald Kamm. He invented the Comtail. I used it on our cars directly on the road. I screwed on some aluminum fairing and judged the performance with or without fairing. We saw that it worked, and we stuck to it. This is a Comtail. I've always remained fascinated by it.
There was only one other designer. When I came, there were just two designers there, so it was very small. It was not like going to General Motors where you had 200 designers, you know, in one place. So it was a very small company. Each designer had their own particular project to do. So here I was, 24 years old, and all of a sudden I was designing a complete car.
The Aston Martin was the first car I designed. I arrived in April 1960, and two cars had to be done right away. John Wyer came personally. He wanted to make a lighter version to enter the competitions, trying to beat the Ferraris. The car turned out well. He liked it very much. It became one of the most expensive cars in the auctions, but it was a bit too heavy to compete with the Ferrari.
The Dino's profile looked something like this.
Se noi guardiamo questo andamento
The shape of the wings looked like that.
e lo invertiamo,
If we invert them,
fuori la Cisitalia.
you roughly get the layout of the Cisitalia.
Adesso, grosso modo. Quindi
The front wing became the rear wing.
il parafango davanti è diventato quello dietro.
So one looks like this, and the other like this. The front and the rear were
C'è
inverted.
stata l'inversione.
Ma tutto non nasce per caso, non è
That kind of creative concentration can't have happened out of the blue. In Turin, a spontaneous design school had developed, which wasn't based on institutions. The great designers learned their craft in the garages, like Spada, even Gandini.
mestiere nelle officine.
Even if he always thought he didn't know enough, because he hadn't been to a school where they taught how to make automobiles, but he knew how to form an opinion, an idea.
Since there were no design schools, you just went to work. I began at 20, right after high school.
I still remember how I, in my freshman year, bought Dante Giacosa's internal combustion engines instead of buying a Latin book. I still have it. It's well worn and never again looked at, but back then I knew it by heart.
My father played the violin and made us learn a musical instrument. That's how it was done back then. My brother and I had to learn to play the piano. I still remember Schumann's Scenes from Childhood. It interested me. I thought of the 3 piano pedals as clutch, brake, and accelerator.
I've never driven a Ferrari. I rode in a Dino, driven by Fioravanti, but I've never driven a Ferrari. I designed them. That satisfied me.
I have a diploma in technical engineering. I have no idea where it is now. I decided that studying was not for me. It took me too long to learn too little. I went down a different path. I chose my teachers myself.
We didn't have a briefing. We didn't have a thick book of all the requirements that we had to do for a car. Back then, they wanted new ideas. They were still in the phase that, something had some new ideas they wanted. They didn't want something to take an idea from a car that had success and copy that car. Everything had to be new.
I learned at Pininfarina the best way to avoid getting fired was to be original. If you design something already familiar, you deserve to be given the sack.
Back then, it was normal to do things differently than they'd been done before or by others. At Bertone, it was especially so, both with regards to the showrooms and to the normal work on prototypes or models.
Prototipi o modelli, eccetera.
The Pantera was produced for almost 22 years. It probably wouldn't really win a concorso d'elegance, for the most elegant car. But it has something about the car that satisfies a lot of, passion. For a sports car, for an elegant car, a nice-looking car. And still today, people buy these cars, they work on them, they take them apart, they fix them. They have very big clubs in America.
The Aston Martin DB4 looks like the mouth of a shark, ready to attack the road.
Buttato un po' fuori, sembra proprio qualcosa che vuole aggredire la strada,
I designed this shape. It was a tight-fitting suit worn over strong muscles. The car body just about holds everything together.
The basic concept of this car was to make the driver more attractive. To reflect a little of its power, aggressiveness onto its driver.
Aggressività su chi la possiede.
There were a few essential flaws. For one thing, it was impossible to look behind you when driving in reverse. But it was possible to compensate for that with a bit of physical effort and some exhibition,ism by sitting on the lateral strut, looking out from the side with the door open. We knew a collector who lived close by, who'd pass through the town square to show off how he drove in reverse, going back and forth. At the Turin Auto Show in 1970, the Bertone company presented a prototype with Lancia mechanics, but totally transformed with the rear engine. It was an interesting prototype, famous even today. But most importantly, it convinced the Lancia executive management to build a specific car for the rallies, the races. Lancia was especially interested in the 6-cylinder Dino Ferrari engine, a very heavy engine with little horsepower. The vehicle made a visual impact right away. Besides, a winning car becomes beautiful even if it's ugly. If it's born beautiful, that's good too. At least that's my opinion.
La fortuna di sia di
Giugiaro and Bertoni, who at the time cooperated, were lucky to have Cingolani, the foreman, working for both of them.
Cingolani era capofficina che poi andò anche da Giugiaro.
Cingolani resolved all the mechanical or technical problems on their prototype.
Tecnici sul prototipo. Come è stato per
He was for them what Comoro and Mora were for Pininfarina. Not to forget all the other people working in blue overalls who received little merit but had great skill. They made these companies' fortunes.
di queste aziende.
Quando Gandini va da Giugiaro, i primi
It was a miracle no one else in the world could have done. Naturally, Gandini didn't do it all on his own. He had panel beaters who did things right the first time.
realizza 3 automobili funzionanti.
The atmosphere during the construction of these 3 prototypes for the Auto Show in Geneva in 1966 wasn't particularly light, which is to say that the work was grueling. They hired many external workers, and the division worked 22 hours a day in 2 11-hour shifts. We worked very fast. There was no time to meditate, no tending to details. Today, we brood over the reasons for this and that. Back then, things got resolved in 3 minutes. There were no philosophical debates, heavens no.
Era un miracolo che nessuno altro al mondo.
It was a miracle no one else in the world could have done. Naturally, Gandini didn't do it all on his own. He had panel beaters who did things right the first time.
Fare le cose al primo colpo.
It's hard to explain. I just did it the way I'd imagined it. Looking at the results, I did a good job.
Mi venivano bene, ecco.
I stuck to the design and tried to learn how to do the rest. Watching the workers whenever I had the chance. Something I always did back then. I mostly learned from my co-workers.
C'è da fare così qui, arrotondo.
Do this part here, round it, soften it. But what does rounding or softening mean? If I say to you, round it, soften it, and you know what I mean, the game's easy. But if you're not on the same wavelength and you don't share a vision of things, it becomes tough, and the result may be terrible.
That was just a sketch, but I'll use it to explain the different phases of my drafts. It was constructed using iron rebars, like the ones you see here. It looks like a kind of wire frame. With that, the panel beater is able to form the aluminum parts later on.
Some use one tool, some another. Giancarlo Guerra used an iron rebar, a hammer, and sheet metal. He just followed his imagination to form masterpieces.
I believe I was the only one to make cars with wires like that.
A fare le macchine col filo così. Perché si pensava
We thought about everything. We thought about encumbrances, about the driver's seat. I made cars. I'd leave an opening to implement the wire. It looked like a transparent car.
Perché era una macchina trasparente.
In questo contesto di poche persone appassionate,
Working together with this small group of enthusiastic people who were extraordinary men with great creative talent was fantastic.
era idilliaca.
We'd joke, argue. Your design is horrendous crap. Mine's more beautiful. But there were no strange moves.
Non c'erano mosse strane.
There was no competition. Everyone had a job to do. There was absolutely no interference among us. Brovarone cars were Brovarones. Sapino ones were Sapinos. Mine were mine. There was no competition.
Non c'era competizione.
It was an unwritten law that the public would not be informed about who was responsible for which car. Back then, nobody knew that I had designed the Ferrari 512 or Martin, the Modulo. Things changed later when everything was handled a bit more liberal. At the time, there was a rather tight regime of secrecy. It was always the master who did the designing, Pininfarina, Bertone. Their name was the one which appeared.
It meant trouble if a stylist working for Bertone or Pininfarina said, "I designed that car," or if he signed a sketch with his own name and not the name of the company. Once Scaglione dared to sign a sketch and sent it to America, Bertone fired him on the spot. "I'm the Bertone company. The rest is nothing."
To be honest, we always found a way to make our sketches known. For example, by putting tiny initials into a corner, even if it was forbidden.
It was a habit of mine. The first time it happened spontaneously, and then I repeated it.
We enjoyed a lot of freedom. Today, things have changed. When I visit a design office, I see many sad faces. They're all gloomy. No one jokes. No one laughs. I think an era has gone by. I believe we've reached a point of no return. Cars are turning into a mere means of transportation. They are supposed to function like a washing machine or a refrigerator.
Today, the way a product is presented is fundamental. The presentation is part of the brand communication. According to market researchers, it's the first or second reason for choosing one vehicle over another. The automobile company has to focus on the presentation of their products. Therefore, the design of the car, the design offices, the true creative development work has become an integral part and the core competence of an automobile company. What used to be an external service is nowadays done within the company itself. Therefore, the companies themselves have become the greatest competitors of the Italian designers. When your customer becomes your main competitor, the competition becomes rather imbalanced.
I believe a new kind of designer has been born. I like to call him a brand designer. Today, the marketing department decides which product is going to be sold. They say, "I want light here, the coffee maker there, the USB there," and they determine what's being done. The poor guy working on the design is just drawing lines without knowing what he's actually doing. In fact, today's products all look alike. They've lost their souls. I call them auto appliances.
If we think of today's cars, after having experienced and heard these stories, everything is so degraded and becomes so plastic comes to mind immediately. In today's cars, electronics aside, everything is so cold, so unworldly.
Today it is very difficult to make something new because there's a mentality, even with a car like a Pantera. I've worked with people in San Diego. We had a client that wanted a car that looked like similar to a sports car that was already on the market. You know, back then that never happened. I was never given an assignment with Ghia Di Tommaso or Pininfarina to make something similar to a car already exists. They wanted something new.
Martinengo always used to come and say, "Martin, do whatever you like."
Diceva, Martin, che fas non che vuol, Cioè vuol dire Martin faccia cosa vuole. Questo era l'input.
This was the only input.
Le macchine che vede
All the
dietro
cars you see behind you were invented with no input requirement. Do what you want.
sono cose
That's
che
all.
faccia cosa vuole.
It was so nice to be able to do what you wanted to do.
Uno faceva cosa voleva.